Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My world is a lexicon of failure. I am a man who makes his living by sifting through the ashes of other people's lives, by translating the silent, blackened language of a ruin into the cold, hard grammar of a financial figure. My name is Jasper, and I am an independent insurance loss adjuster. I am a professional witness to catastrophe. I walk through the skeletal remains of burned-out homes, of flooded businesses, of collapsed structures, and I see not the tragedy, but the math. I see the stress fractures in a charred support beam, the high watermark on a stained wall, the subtle, telltale V-pattern of an accelerant burn on a hardwood floor. My job is to find the truth, the objective, quantifiable truth, buried beneath the emotional rubble of loss. It is a quiet, solitary, and deeply cynical profession, and it has taught me one fundamental lesson. Everything, no matter how solid it appears, can fail. For the last 5 years, my own life has been a quiet, ongoing exercise in rebuilding after a catastrophic failure of our own. We had not lost our home to a fire or a flood, but to a slower, more insidious disaster. A series of failed investments and the crushing weight of medical debt from my father's final illness. We had found ourselves on the brink of bankruptcy, a position so precarious that the very foundation of our life together was threatening to give way. The solution, when it came, was not mine. It was my wife's. Cora, my beautiful, resilient, and endlessly pragmatic wife. The solution was her sacrifice. She had inherited her family home, a beautiful, old Victorian house on the other side of town, a place filled with the ghosts of her own happy childhood. It was her only real asset, a piece of her soul. And she had, without a moment's hesitation, offered it up to the dragon of our debt. She had sold it. I remember the day she told me, her eyes full of a sad but resolute strength. "It's just a house, Jas," she had said, taking my hand. "We can build a new life. As long as we have each other, we can build it anywhere." Her sacrifice had saved us. It had paid off the debts. It had given us a clean slate. We had moved into a small, cramped, and soulless rental apartment, but we were solvent. We were survivors. And I was a man who now carried a new and profound debt of my own, a debt of gratitude to the woman who had sacrificed her past to secure our future. My life since that day has been a quiet, relentless mission to repay that debt. I worked constantly. I took every job, no matter how remote or how grim. I was a machine, converting my time, my expertise, my very life force into the money that would, one day, allow me to give her back everything she had lost. Our dream was a simple one, a small piece of land, a new house, one that we would own, one that would be ours, built not on the foundations of a tragic inheritance, but on the bedrock of our own hard work. Our life in the small apartment was a temporary, functional thing. It was a waiting room. We were two partners in a long-term, high-stakes project of reconstruction. Our love, I believed, had been forged into something stronger in the crucible of our shared hardship. We were not just lovers, we were allies, survivors. The call that began the demolition of this, my final and most cherished illusion, came on a Monday morning. It was a new client, an anonymous referral from a law firm. The job was a standard one, a full structural assessment of a residential fire. The property was on Elm Street, on the old, historic side of town. I took the job without a second thought. It was just another ruin, another set of numbers, another step on the long road back to solvency. The drive to the site was routine. I listened to a podcast about forensic accounting. I mentally rehearsed the checklist of things I would need to document. I was in my professional headspace, the cool, detached, analytical mind of the adjuster. I turned onto Elm Street, a beautiful, tree-lined road I had not been down in years. And as I neared the address I had been given, a cold, familiar dread began to prickle at the edges of my consciousness. I knew this street. I knew these trees. I pulled up to the curb. The house, or what was left of it, was a skeletal, blackened ruin, its bones exposed to the gray morning sky. Yellow caution tape was stretched across the front, a flimsy, pathetic barrier against the magnitude of the loss. But I was not looking at the ruin. I was looking at the ancient, magnificent oak tree that still stood, its leaves scorched but its branches intact in the front yard. The tree where Cora and I had carved our initials inside a lopsided heart on our third date. The house was not just a house. It was her house. It was the house she had sold, the house she had sacrificed to save us. My first thought was a wave of profound, empathetic sorrow for the poor, unknown family who had bought it, whose own dreams had now been turned to ash. I got out of my truck, my movement stiff, my professional detachment suddenly and violently shattered. I was standing on holy ground, the site of my wife's greatest sacrifice, and it had been desecrated. I began my work, my hands moving with a new, strange, and almost reverent slowness. I documented the exterior, the melted siding, the collapsed porch roof. But my mind was not on the job. It was lost in a sea of ghosts, of memories of a life that was not mine, but that was inextricably tied to mine. I remembered a summer barbecue in this very backyard. I remembered helping her father hang a swing from one of the branches of that oak tree. I was not just an adjuster. I was a mourner, a pilgrim at a ruined shrine. I finally forced the front door open, the wood groaning in protest, and I stepped inside. The interior was a hellscape of charred wood, of melted plastic, of the thick, acrid smell of a dead fire. I began to move through the rooms, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, my camera documenting the extent of the damage. I was in the living room, a space I remembered as being full of light and laughter, now a black, cavernous tomb. And then I saw it, a small, almost insignificant detail on the wall next to the fireplace. It was a patch of wallpaper that had been protected from the worst of the flames by a fallen bookshelf. And on that wallpaper was a faint pencil mark and a date. It was a growth chart, a series of small horizontal lines marking the height of a child, of Cora, as she had grown up in this house. But there was another set of marks, more recent, fresher. I knew my own children's heights. I had marked them just like this on a doorframe in our own rented apartment. And these new marks, the ones that had been made in this house, were not Cora's. They were the marks of my own children, Liam and Chloe. A single, impossible, and world-shattering fact bloomed in the darkness of that ruined room. My children had been in this house, recently, regularly. The house had not been sold to a stranger. The foundation of the lie I had been living for 5 years, the lie that had defined my every action, my every sacrifice, was so profound, so absolute, that I did not even have the words to name it. She had never sold the house. She had never made the sacrifice. And my entire life, my long, grinding, and supposedly noble penance, had been built on a foundation of absolute and unforgivable smoke. The pencil marks on the wall were a key, unlocking a door in my mind that I had never known was locked. Behind that door was not a single simple lie, but an entire alternate reality, a life that had been running in parallel to my own, hidden in plain sight. I stood in the silence of that ruined room, the only sound the dripping of water from the fire hoses and the frantic, chaotic hammering of my own heart. My professional training, the cold, analytical instinct of the adjuster, was my only life raft in the sudden, violent flood of this new truth. I had to be a professional. I had to be Jasper, the man who documents, the man who assesses. The grieving, betrayed husband could come later. Right now, I had a job to do. And that job was no longer just about assessing the fire damage. It was about conducting a full, forensic investigation of my own life. I began to move through the house with a new, cold purpose.
Every object, every piece of debris was no longer just a casualty of a fire. It was a potential clue, an artifact from a life I had not been a part of. The official story, the one I had been told, was that the house had been sold as is, with all the old family furniture still inside. But the furniture in these ruins was not the heavy, dark antique furniture I remembered from Cora's parents. It was new, it was modern, it was the same generic and soulless style of furniture that filled the catalogs of rental staging companies. On the floor of what had been the kitchen, I found a pile of partially burned mail. I carefully sifted through the charred, damp paper. It was not addressed to Cora. It was not addressed to a new owner. It was addressed to resident. Utility bills, junk mail, and a lease agreement from a property management company. The lie was becoming clearer, its architecture more defined. She had not sold the house. She had, it seemed, turned it into a rental property. She had been collecting an income, a secret, undeclared income, for 5 years, while I had been working myself into an early grave to pay off a debt that had likely been settled long ago, or that had perhaps never even been as large as she had claimed. The sacrifice had not been a sacrifice. It had been a business decision. She had converted her family home into a passive income stream, and she had converted me into the active income stream that paid for our life, leaving her own secret profits untouched, accumulating in an account I did not know about. I moved upstairs to the master bedroom, and there, in the wreckage of the walk-in closet, I found the heart of the deception. In the corner, warped by the heat but not completely destroyed, was a small, metal, fireproof safe. It was a model I recognized. It was the same one we had in our own rented apartment. A small, simple safe for which I knew the combination. Our anniversary. Her hand shaking, I knelt in the soot and the ash, and I turned the dial. Left to our anniversary month. Right to the day. Left to the year. The lock clicked open. My heart was a slow, heavy, and painful drum. I was not just opening a safe, I was opening a tomb. Inside, there was no jewelry, there were no family heirlooms, there were just documents, sealed in a waterproof, fire-resistant bag. I took them out. The first was a bank book, for a private, out-of-state bank. The account was in her name only. I opened it. The balance was a number so large, so staggering, that it did not seem real. It was a fortune, a life-changing amount of money. The deposits were regular, monthly, and they corresponded exactly with the rental income from this house, and I saw with a new, sickening wave of understanding, from 2 other properties I had never even known existed. The second set of documents was a portfolio statement from an investment firm. The portfolio was aggressive, high risk, high yield, and it was performing spectacularly. She had not just been collecting rent. She had been investing. She had been building an empire in secret. The final document was not a financial statement. It was a business plan. A detailed, professional, and beautifully rendered plan for a small boutique cafe in a trendy coastal town in California. The plan included architectural drawings, profit and loss projections, a marketing strategy. And on the cover page, under the elegant, aspirational name of the cafe, The Harbor, were the names of the 2 proprietors, Cora and a man named Marcus. Marcus. The name was a stranger's, and yet I knew, with a certainty that was as absolute as the law of gravity, that he was the reason for all of this. He was the ghost in this machine. He was the man she was building this new secret life for. The fire, I now knew, was not an accident. My professional eye, which I now turned to the scene with a new brutal clarity, saw the signs everywhere. The way the fire had started in multiple locations at once. The telltale alligator skin charring on the floorboards that spoke of a liquid accelerant. This was not a tragedy. This was an exit strategy. The final spectacular act of a long-running play. She was going to collect on the massive insurance policy on this house, a policy I now knew she had likely increased to an exorbitant amount. And she was going to take that money and her secret fortune, and she was going to disappear with him to a new life on the coast, a life that was to be built on the ashes of this one. I stood up.
I placed the documents carefully back in the bag, and I put the bag in my own fireproof evidence case. I was no longer a husband. I was no longer a victim. I was the primary witness to a multi-year, multi-million-dollar fraud and insurance scam, and the perpetrator was my own wife. I finished my assessment of the property with a cold, mechanical efficiency. I documented everything. I took hundreds of photographs. I made my notes. My report would be a masterpiece of professional, dispassionate analysis. It would be a perfect, undeniable, and utterly damning indictment of the truth. I left the house as the sun was beginning to set. I did not go back to our apartment. I could not. It was not a home. It was just another part of the stage set. I checked into a hotel, and I began to work. I began to write the report that would be the first strategic and perfectly placed charge in the controlled demolition of my wife's secret world. I was an adjuster, a man who calculates the cost of a loss, and I was about to present my wife with a bill for the last 5 years of my life, a bill that I knew with an absolute and satisfying certainty she would be utterly unable to pay. The hotel room became my new headquarters, a sterile, anonymous command center for a war that only I knew was being waged. For a week, I was a ghost. I did not contact Cora. I did not answer her increasingly frantic calls and texts. To her, I had simply vanished. I needed the silence. I needed the space to think, to plan, to transform the raw, chaotic energy of my pain and rage into a clear, cold, and brutally effective strategy. My opponent was not a stupid woman. She was a brilliant, patient, and ruthless strategist. A frontal assault, a loud, emotional confrontation would be a mistake. It would give her time to react, to spin a new story, to play the victim. My attack had to be a silent one. It had to come from an angle she would never expect. It had to come from within the very system she was trying to exploit. My weapon of choice was my report. It was the one piece of power I had. I spent a week crafting it with the meticulous, obsessive focus of a watchmaker. It was the most important document I had ever written. On the surface, it was a standard, professional loss assessment. It detailed the structural damage, the replacement costs, the salvageable assets. It was full of the dry, technical jargon of my trade. But woven into its pages, between the lines of the building codes and the depreciation tables, was a quiet, damning, and irrefutable narrative of the truth. I included my photographs of the arson evidence, the multiple points of origin, the chemical test results from the samples I had taken that showed the presence of an accelerant. I documented with a cool, clinical precision that the fire was, without a doubt, an act of deliberate arson. That was the first charge. The second charge was more subtle. In the section on the property's history, I included a copy of the original deed in her parents' name. And then I included a record from the county clerk's office showing that the deed had never been transferred, that there had been no sale. I simply presented the two documents side by side without comment. The discrepancy was a quiet, ticking time bomb in the heart of the report. The final and most devastating charge was the inventory of the contents. I listed the items in the fireproof safe. I listed the bank book from the out-of-state account. I listed the investment portfolio. And I listed the business plan for the Harbor Cafe, including the name of her partner, Marcus. I did not frame this as a discovery of a betrayal. I framed it as a standard part of the asset assessment, a necessary step in calculating the total value of the loss for the insurance company. I was not a husband exposing his wife's affair. I was an adjuster, dispassionately cataloging the contents of a client's safe.
The genius of the report, the part that my lawyer, a sharp, cold-eyed woman I had hired named Ms. Devereaux, had admired with a professional, predatory glee, was its absolute, unassailable objectivity. I was not the victim in the story.
I was the narrator, and the story I told was one of simple, undeniable, and criminal fact. While the report was being finalized, I began the second phase of my plan, the psychological operation. I needed to understand the man who had been the ghost in my marriage, the man for whom Cora had been willing to burn her world to the ground. I needed to know Marcus. Devereaux's private investigator was a man of quiet, almost supernatural efficiency. Within 48 hours, I had a complete dossier on him. He was not the wealthy, successful businessman I had imagined. He was a grifter, a small-time con artist with a string of failed businesses and a history of charming and then bankrupting, lonely, well-off women. He was a parasite, and Cora had been his latest and most lucrative host. The cafe in California was not their shared dream. It was his exit strategy, a way to launder the insurance money and disappear, leaving her to take the fall. The knowledge was a strange, bitter, and deeply unsatisfying pill to swallow. My wife had not betrayed me for a great love. She had betrayed me for a cheap, second-rate con man. She had traded a life of honest, if difficult love for a counterfeit. My rage towards her began to be replaced by a kind of profound, almost overwhelming pity. She was not just a criminal, she was a fool. She was a victim of a different kind of fire, the fire of her own desperate and deeply misguided loneliness. But my pity did not alter my plan. The demolition had to proceed. I was no longer just fighting for my own justice. I was fighting to save her from the very man she had chosen over me. The final step was to set the trap. On a Monday morning, Devereaux submitted my report. But we did not submit it to the anonymous law firm that had been the original client. We submitted it directly and simultaneously to two places: the head of the Special Investigations Unit of the National Insurance Company, and to the District Attorney's Office under the file heading Suspected Felony Insurance Fraud and Arson. The charges had been placed. The fuse had been lit. Now all I had to do was wait for the detonation. I knew that the moment the SIU investigator and the DA's office saw my report, with its cold, hard, and meticulously documented evidence, they would open a full-scale joint investigation. And the first two people they would want to talk to would be the policyholder, Cora, and her business partner, Marcus. And I knew, with the certainty of a man who understands human nature at its most desperate, that when the pressure was applied, their beautiful, criminal partnership would not bend, it would shatter. The day after the report was filed, I finally answered one of Cora's endless, frantic calls. Her voice was a mixture of relief and a high-strung, anxious anger. "Jasper, my God, where have you been? I've been so worried. The house, our house, there was a fire." "I know, Cora," I said, my voice a calm, quiet, and utterly unrecognizable thing. I was the adjuster. The silence on the other end of the line was a physical, tangible thing. I could almost hear the gears in her mind grinding to a halt, trying to process the impossible, catastrophic implications of that single sentence. What did you say?" she stammered. "The report has been filed," I said, my voice still a flat, dead calm. "It's a very thorough report. I'm sure the insurance company will have some questions for you. And for Marcus. You should probably expect a call." And then I hung up. I had not shouted, I had not accused. I had simply and quietly informed her that the controlled burn I had been planning for a month was now a full-blown and inescapable firestorm, and she was standing directly in its path. The days that followed that final, quiet phone call were a masterclass in the physics of consequence. I had set the system in motion, and now I was a distant, silent observer, watching the inevitable, predictable collapse. My lawyer, Miss Devereaux, provided me with regular, discreet updates. The joint investigation had been launched with an almost immediate and ferocious intensity. The evidence in my report had been too compelling, too detailed to ignore. Cora and Marcus had been brought in for separate and apparently very lengthy interviews.
Their stories, Devereaux told me with a grim professional satisfaction, had not aligned. Under the pressure of a felony investigation, their beautiful criminal partnership had disintegrated, just as I had predicted. They had turned on each other with the vicious, instinctual desperation of two drowning people fighting over a single piece of driftwood. Marcus, the professional grifter, had tried to paint Cora as the obsessive, unstable mastermind, a woman who had seduced him into her criminal enterprise. Cora, in her panicked amateur terror, had told the investigators everything, producing emails and text messages from Marcus that proved he had been the architect of the entire insurance fraud scheme. They had not been partners in a great love. They had been co-conspirators in a simple, greedy crime. And when the structure had failed, they had both, without a moment's hesitation, tried to save themselves by pushing the other into the flames. The legal outcome was a quiet, brutal, and almost anticlimactic affair. Faced with my report and their own, mutually destructive testimony, they both took plea deals. Marcus, with his prior history of fraud, received a significant prison sentence. Cora, as a first-time offender who had cooperated with the prosecution, received a lighter sentence. Probation, community service, and a legally mandated restitution order that would force her to pay back every single dollar of the fraudulent rental income she had collected for 5 years. The house, the beautiful, ruined monument to our dead marriage, was seized by the state. The insurance company, of course, denied the claim. Her secret fortune, the one she had been building on the back of my sacrifice, was wiped out by legal fees and restitution payments. She was left with nothing. Not the house, not the money, not the man, not the dream. Just the quiet, empty, and solitary reality of her own choices. I was not a part of any of it. My name was never mentioned in the news reports. I was just the anonymous, expert consultant whose report had initiated the investigation. My role as the betrayed husband was a secret that I, and now she, would carry forever. I did not feel a sense of triumph. I did not feel a sense of revenge. I felt only a profound and deeply weary sense of closure. The ledger was balanced. The assessment was complete. The file was closed. A few months after the sentencing, I received a letter. It was forwarded to me by Devereaux's office. It was from Cora. It was a single handwritten page. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was a confession of a different kind. "I know you will never understand why," she wrote, "but I need you to know that it was not because I did not love you. It was because I did. Your goodness, your sacrifice, it was a constant, unbearable mirror. And I hated the person I saw in it. I wanted to be someone else, somewhere else. I wanted to build a world where I was not in your debt. I see now, I just built a different kind of prison. I hope, one day, you can build a house that is just for you." I read the letter once, and then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I burned it. I watched the paper curl and turn to black ash in the sink of my small, clean, and completely empty apartment. She was right. It was time to build a house that was just for me. My life now was a quiet, simple thing. I left the city. I moved to a small, coastal town where no one knows my name or my story. I still work as an adjuster, but I have my own small one-man firm. I take on small jobs. I help people navigate the confusing, often painful, aftermath of small, honest disasters. I am a man who helps people rebuild. The money from the restitution payments arrives in my account every month, a small, steady, and anonymous reminder of a past I am slowly, deliberately putting behind me. I do not spend it. I put it into a separate account, a fund. I have not decided what to do with it yet, but I know it will not be used to build a house of my own. My dream is different now. It is smaller, it is quieter, it is more real.
I am learning, one day at a time, to live in the world as it is, not as I want it to be. I am learning to see the difference between a structure that is built to last and one that is designed from the very beginning to burn. And I am learning, finally, to trust the foundation of my own quiet and solitary life. If you stayed with me to the end, I want to hear your story. When did someone you trusted reveal their true self? Comment below, and make sure to like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers, where real stories are shared every day.